case, I will. All right. I didn't do a head count. So. Okay, bat call parameters. What can be measured? How are they measured? What are useful for ID? I already touched on the harmonics, not necessarily critical for identification. Identification issues. Well, it's complicated, and we'll get into that. It's complicated in many ways, and this is why you can't trust the black boxes. There are a lot of software algorithms out there right now that are, oh, you don't have to know anything about bats. Buy our software for $3,000, and you too can identify your bats. It will tell you what it is. Well, unfortunately, they're not there yet. Sometime in the distant future, the algorithms are probably going to get really good. Human speech recognition is really good now, but in the bat research world, nobody's spending hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars to develop it. I guess there's not that big of a market. I actually provided for Wildlife Acoustics, who make the song meters and have the kaleidoscope software with their own built-in algorithms for identifications. I provided a huge amount of data for the neotropics to see how well the algorithms work. It's kind of like that classic film with Paul Newman and the pool hustler, where he's shooting pool with the guy and goes, "Well, you're in trouble. You taught me everything I know." And he responded, "Yeah, I didn't teach you everything I know." You know, so the algorithms are using some of the samples. When I challenged them with novel and new species that were the same, they failed horrendously. At one of the workshops in South Florida in 2016, we had one beautiful bat pass call sequence of a Tiderida, a big free-tailed bat, wonderfully recorded, no noise, no clutter, and the auto classification had it listed as 3 species, 2 different genera from one call. So it's got a ways to go. What I've had people, it's a lot of these workshops, can't you just show me what buttons to click? I just want answers. Again, in other words, is it necessary to learn all this stuff about vocal signatures and call parameters? No, only if you want to be acknowledged doing good science. Acoustic ID is no different than any other discipline. If you're going to be a plant taxonomist, an insect person, work on butterflies, I don't care what it is, you're going to have to learn the terminology, the key characteristics, how to identify things. In my formative years, my undergraduate days, I started off as a water beetle taxonomist. So I kind of got off into taxonomy and zoogeography. But within the world of Coleoptera, there's entire lexicons and languages for the scarab beetle specialists, the cerambicids, the longhorn wood-boring beetle specialists. They speak entirely different languages, really, that have to do with the characters of their critters. But if you're going to specialize in a given taxa, it's important that you understand what the criteria are to identify. So it's no different than working with any other group. Quote Charles Krebs from his Ecological Methodology text from way back when, "Not everything that can be measured should be. One problem is that all sciences face is what to measure. History of science is littered with examples of measurements that turn out not to have been useful." Terms to understand that are important and useful. The single echolocation sound is referred to a pulse or a call. They're used interchangeably in the literature. Call sequence is what you need to use for identifying species, and that's a continuous string of pulses. The vocal signature, I've mentioned before, search phase call sequence that's diagnostic for identifying a given species. generally has both genus and familial similarities. Harmonics. It's important to understand harmonics. It's a sound wave with a frequency that's a positive integer, and it's an exact multiple of the original frequency, which is referred to as the fundamental frequency. The fundamental frequency is also called the first harmonic. A lot of people have been confused on this, and they were using the bat call frequency where they were recording them as the first or fundamental frequency and then ramping it up from there, which wasn't correct because frequently those calls were actually the second harmonic or dominant harmonic. So, repeat after me. First harmonic is H1. First harmonic is H1. So it's always the same. It never changes. The second and third harmonics are important as related to bats. These call pulses that have a frequency that is an exact multiple of the fundamental, or the H1. As an example, a call with a fundamental at 20 kilohertz would have the second harmonic, the H2, would be 40 kilohertz, is what you'd measure, and the third harmonic would be at 60. So depending on the species, the loudest call, or those with the maximum energy, are usually the second harmonic. This is also referred to as the dominant harmonic, the H2. Some full spectrum recorders may also record the H1 or H3 as having the most energy, in other words, as the loudest pulses. But the harmonic is always an exact multiple of the original call. With species, we have yet to confirm, or under some field conditions, we can't tell with new species which harmonic we're viewing. So the concept of the dominant harmonic is useful. Depending on the software used to display and generate call parameters, measurements, definitions, and usage may differ. You need to be aware of that. All bat acoustic software is not equal, and measured values may not be comparable. Important example is the slope of the call. This is the change in frequency like we saw in the early graph as the call pulses slope and change with time as the frequency decreases. Although this can either be from high to low, low to high, or in some cases they go up, across, and down again. But the slopes are important. Most programs don't measure this in a useful or comparable way. Most seem to measure the slope of a call as kilohertz change in slope per millisecond of time. Analog W, which we'll discuss in more detail, uses a different measure, octaves per second. Well, does it matter? Well, turns out it does matter. The slope is always the rate of change of a call pulse of the frequency over time. The frequency generally is falling with time in most calls, so it makes sense to think of it as the rate of decrease of frequency with time. Otherwise, most of the numbers would be a negative number. Quoting Chris Corbin, who wrote the software for Analog, also invented all the Anabat detectors. He's a biologist in training, but he also understands physics better than anybody that I've ever run across, designed all the electronic circuits for the equipment, writes the software, does everything that he's up to here, and you almost can never talk to him because he's busy multitasking 12 things simultaneously. Anyway, he says in the linear form, you can measure the kilohertz per millisecond. This is the difference in frequency between the start of the body of a call and the end, and you divide it by the duration of the body of the call. Now this has disadvantages, although it seems natural to people who don't understand nature or avoid logarithms. In the linear form, the key disadvantage is if you measure the slope of the call at the dominant harmonic, or H2, the slope will then be twice the slope of that same call at H1. So you can't even compare the slope of the call between the two harmonics. So essentially, the measurement of kilohertz per milliseconds for slope is meaningless unless you actually know what the frequency is where it was measured. For an example, for the Florida bonneted bat, the UMOPS, at a very low, it's a low frequency bat, down around 12, 13, sometimes 14 kilohertz, down in the human audible range. 1 kilohertz per millisecond would be a very, very steep call slope. However, if that were a myotis, a little brown bat, at a much higher frequency, that would be a very flat call slope. So you can't compare if you're using that linear form. So not only is using the linear measurement non-comparable, you can't even compare between harmonics of the same individual's call for a given species. The log form, or as Chris says, the correct and comparable way to measure the slope is using octaves per second. And this is used in the analog program we'll be talking about. This is based on the ratio of the start frequency to the final frequency of the body divided by the time between both of them, the start and the end. And a definition from physics relating to sound, an octave is a doubling or halving of a given sound frequency. It's a little bit different than an octave in music, although that also refers to sound, but it's important to understand, or at least be conversant of what that means. With octaves per second, all the harmonics have exactly the same slope, whether you're measuring H2 or H1, or if you're likely to record H3, they would all have exactly the same slope using this measurement. So a call with a 20 octave per second slope is called a low slope in terms of what the range that bats can produce, regardless of what frequency it's recorded or detecting at. So it's important to know how the software you're using is measuring these. So you can't really try and identify a bat using slopes of milliseconds, frequency per millisecond, and then compare it if you're actually using different software. It's just not going to be comparable. For those who are numbers driven and want to look below the hood, so to speak, there are the calculations. It'll be in the PDF if anybody really wants to see how that's done. For consistency, I'll be referring to the parameters that are measured and used by Analog, which is, and Analog W is there because in the early days, Windows wasn't out there when we were recording. A lot of things were DOS-based programs, and early Windows 3.1 and all those kind of primitive sort of days then. But he renamed Analog with the W, so it's optimized and it runs under Windows these days. Call parameters that are measured include frequency-related calls, FC, characteristic frequency, minimum frequency, max, mean, and these are all measured in kilohertz. Slope-related measurements, characteristic slope, SC and S1, measured in octaves per second. Then there's some other parameters we'll talk about. There's time parameters, duration of a call pulse, measured in milliseconds. Also TBC, or time between calls, literally the time intervals in between the individual bat calls. The bats don't call nonstop. They stop and take a breath. And actually, with a lot of bats, the call pulses are synchronized to wing beats. So they're calling as they're flying. So you can actually infer other things from time between call pulses. Frequency parameters. FC, the characteristic frequency, measured in kilohertz. This is the frequency at the right-hand end of the portion of a call pulse where absolutely the lowest slope shows up on what they call the body, the main part of the bat call. This is the single most important parameter for species identification. In publications, again, full spectrum terminology, FC is frequently referred to as the frequency with maximum energy, or the loudest part of the call, and that's where they measure it. And a lot of the full spectrum software, you do get, instead of nice crisp graphics that you can measure on, you get these ink blot sort of smudges, and people are manually moving their mouse around trying to get a measurement, and that can actually impact what your results are. FC shows considerable robustness compared to all other frequency measures. It also has a linkage to the shape features of the call. Key reason why it's robust is it occurs where the call is at the highest amplitude, the loudest. So this is the part you're almost always going to record, even if the bat is off in the next room somewhere, and you're going to miss a lot of the other call parameters because those parts of the call will be lost just due to physics of sound. But the FC will be detected. Number of other frequency parameters that are measured, most aren't especially useful for identification. They're interesting to look at, and they're really dependent on the conditions when recorded. Especially true of the maximum frequency. A lot of calls start at low frequency, and as the bat gets closer to you, the frequency doesn't increase, but you're detecting more of the high frequency. And physics of sound, high frequencies drop out further than low frequencies. That's why ships have low frequency foghorns. You can hear the, 10 miles away. If they had a little pipsqueak whistle, you probably couldn't hear it 100 meters away. Sound just doesn't carry. That's why elephants can communicate, and cetaceans in the water, real low frequency sound rumble. Travels great distances. The point at which a call is first detected when you're recording is dependent on the distance from the bat detector. Other factors determine how much of the initial downsweep will be detected. And that's a common reason why it appears to raise and lower, as I just talked about. You see it increasing to the right over time, and you see the frequency scale on the left. Typical vespertilianid, and then as it flies by, the frequency starts dropping off on the right-hand side. Bats doing the same thing, calling the same rate, same volume and everything all the way along. It's just that in this case, this is probably a Lazuris looking at the call, but that's physics of sound, not what the bat call is. Minimum frequency, F min, always the lowest recorded frequency. F max is the highest. Sweep is interesting. This is also referred to as bandwidth. This is the difference between the highest part of the call recorded and the lowest part. Bandwidth we'll get back into shortly. F mean and mean frequency. This is the average frequency of a call, simply dividing the area under the call by the duration of the call. Other parameters, DC and measured in milliseconds is the duration of the body of the call. There's a lot of times it's poorly defined depending on recording conditions. Again, a lot of these, well, all of this will be available in the PDF. Time at the start of the call to where the FC, the characteristic frequency, is measured. This is from the start of the call towards the right end of the call body. So you can actually measure the this subset of the call duration. FK, this is the frequency at the knee. The knee is a part of the call where the call slope abruptly changes as it comes down from a big slope and then starts going out here and moving a little bit. That break point, if it's well defined, is called the knee. Why he came up with the call of the knee is a term, I don't know, but it's stuck. Frequently, the knee isn't well defined in recordings. You can actually measure the time of the start of the call to the knee, not very meaningful for identification. Time between calls, interpulse time in milliseconds, the time from the beginning to the end of each pulse to the start of the next. Bandwidth or sweep, again measured in kilohertz, with complete range of frequencies in the call. It's very easy. The minimum and maximum frequency, it's a simple subtraction. Bandwidth or sweep is actually used to characterize the various families. The mollusids are characterized as narrow bandwidth calls. Vespertilionids, the evening bats, are broadband calls, have a real broad frequency range. These are characteristics that help you as you first start going through your data to start visually grouping data and measuring things, so you can start seeing you have narrowband or broadband species, and then further subdivide from there. So it is useful. We've already talked about pulse slope parameters with octaves per second. The initial slope, S1, is useful to a degree, but for most purposes for ID, it's not that helpful, because the bats change this in response to clutter. As the S1 shifts, it may actually mean the bats are flying more in clutter and not doing search phase calls. So it's a degree at which it's detected, but it can be measured, and it's there in a lot of different software. But for identification purposes, the initial slope of the call isn't that useful. Characteristic slope is more useful. This is the slope of the body of the call, which is a smaller section of the pulse. Very important feature for characterizing species that otherwise may have the very same characteristic frequencies. You can have a lot of species that their characteristic frequencies overlap, but they may be different genera, different families, and call slopes and other things will help differentiate them. Characteristic slope can also act as a surrogate for clutter. You need to just be aware of it. So a bat in high clutter, which means it's detecting echoes from vegetation around it, may change its call emissions in order to avoid obstacles, and things get real messy on your computer screen. It's not a nice, clear call. So it's important that critical distinction between species, which differ using SC, is only useful if you understand your ecology and you know where you're recording the bats. If you're recording in an area without much clutter, it's going to be real helpful for you. If you're in an understory forest area where there's vines, clutter, and everything else, SC may be a little more difficult to use, but it is a useful parameter. There are time parameters, duration of the call pulse. Simply measure the beginning of the pulse to the end. This is calculated as the difference in time between the first data point, the little dot on the screen, to the last data point of that entire pulse. PMC is something that Chris came up with. This is very useful. It's the proportion of the maximum frequency to the characteristic frequency. This helps differentiate species that may be similar. As an example, if the maximum frequency is the same as the characteristic frequency, the PMC would be 0. If the Max frequency is twice the characteristic frequency. The PMC would be 100. And this is useful in separating out calls where there's very little overall decrease in frequency, where they may have similar slopes or be narrow band or whatever. The SC, the characteristic slope on its own, isn't that effective. It doesn't tell us anything about the maximum frequency. So two calls could have the same characteristic frequency, but the one with the lower F max would also have a lower PMC value. So that's useful. So to distill it down, of all the echolocation pulse parameters that are measured in analog and other software, the most useful parameters for species identification we've distilled down to these. This is an example of one of the statistic outputs that we do from the program we'll be talking about a little bit later and used in the call fact sheets that are going to be freely distributed. But it shows you the duration, time between calls, F-min, F-max, bandwidth, minimum, or rather mean frequency, frequency at the knee, characteristic frequency, characteristic slope, and the PMC value. And what I've done with calculating these is not only give you the number of pulses, and you can see we've got large sample sizes here. That's because we're doing robust science, so to speak. A lot of the early published work, we're publishing calls that they recorded. Sample size was 5 call sequences. They measured 12 pulses, and they came up with, here's the entire range of the bat with 12 call pulses. Well, turns out a lot of those were useful and they're great starting points. But when you're looking at hundreds of thousands of call pulses, then you can start saying your results are a little more robust. But in addition to minimum and maximum, and you can see the duration of a call pulse is quite variable in this particular species in milliseconds. And then there's a mean, standard deviation for folks that want it. But then I started looking at the percentile bins, and 90% of all the call data falls within this level. So when you're actually trying to identify calls that you don't know what they are, if you're trying to build a filter to help identify, which I'll discuss again later, this particular species, you might look at 75 to 90 percentiles of using these call parameters rather than the absolute minimum and maximum, because this is going to give you a little more robust information. And again, another example of measuring call pulses. The time scale on the bottom are 10 milliseconds. And it shows on the right the little inset, the characteristic frequency, you know, where you see the call pulse actually changes shape and slope. That would be the knee. So they have the total duration of the call pulse, and then there's the knee is there, the F-min, F-max, just to give you an idea of what's being measured. Something to keep in mind, there are a lot of calls that can be recorded, and are. Not every call is going to be useful for identifying your species. Turns out only the vocal signature search phase calls are diagnostic to a given taxa. Not useful but for IDs, but frequently recorded, are commute calls. These are generic, pretty much narrow bandwidth calls. As the bat's flying across campus from a roost, say in a bell tower somewhere, off outside of town to forage, they're not using search phase calls. They just want to avoid hitting buildings. So they have a real flat call, sometimes long, sometimes short duration, but they're real generic across multitudes of species and families. They're just trying to avoid obstacles. So they're just bouncing sound around, and they're not diagnostic. But the commute calls, as they're commuting from point A to B, aren't diagnostic. Social calls, as they're communicating with each other, aren't diagnostic. Feeding buzzes, and I showed you in a couple of examples earlier. Fragmented calls, which we'll talk about. Echoes off solid surfaces, glass, you know, big windows, water surfaces, ponds, lakes, streams. Clutter calls. Clutter calls include roost recording and hand releasing. These are some examples. There's a commute call, kind of in the middle. It almost went into a search phase call, but then went back down into a generic commute call. Social calls, interesting stuff. I mean, they're making sounds, doing all kinds of stuff. None of them are diagnostic to the species. I've had people send me, I can't figure out what this is. You've sent me the ID keys, and boy, none of this matches. Well, they're talking to each other. Fragmented calls. I didn't bother doing it this time, but when I'm doing the week-long course, I usually play a couple of sounds. And way back when, in the archaic days, there was a TV program called Name That Tune, where they would have a panel of experts and they would play one or two notes of a musical tune, and somebody was supposed to name what the tune was. Well, out of context, nobody can name a tune with one note. You have to go, dun. Okay, what's that? Well, it could be Jaws, dun, 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 or it could be da 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 da. Out of context, a single note isn't going to tell you squat. Same thing with bats. If you have a fragmented call, out of context, you can't identify it. In this case, I know what it is, because I was there. But the bat is a long way from the detector. He's getting closer to the detector, and we're seeing a little more definition of the call. And now he's within complete range. And there's the full search sequence. And you can see a few little fragments down low where it was quiet, but fragmented calls in and of themselves can't be used to identify bats out of context. Now, if you're recording in an area and you have bats within context within a few seconds of each other, and I had this on my screen, and then it went back to the first slide we had with just the little fragments, I know it's the same guy. If he's within, say, a second or two of each other. Probably not some other species that just suddenly came in that is very similar. So you can identify some of the fragments if you're looking at complete call sequences in context of everything you're doing. But isolated is a passive recording with a black box out in the field. You have no idea what's going on. Maybe not so much. If there's a big time gap, 10, 15 seconds between calls, and you have a fragment, you could guess, but it's probably not going to be really good. If you're really close in time, within a second or two, chances are you would be able to identify it in context. Clutter calls. Well, not much to see there, other than this is a real high frequency bat. Look at the frequencies on the left there. Pretty broad band, but not much definition, so you can't really tell much what it is. This was a hand-released bat. This is actually Townsend's big-eared bat, one of the US species that's here. Great big ears, fairly quiet, echolocating bat. Clutter calls. Did a lot of, as I said, real-time recording under controlled conditions out in the field. On the left is a hand-released vespertilianid evening bat. Low-intensity calls. They're really quiet. Very similar to flying in high clutter. It leaves the roost. Over to the right, as it left the roost and we followed it in real time, and he moved around, it shifted over to search phase calls. Those are diagnostic. The leaving roost calls on the left are not. Leaving a roost over on the left, oops, and hand release on the right. Calls are very similar. So hand release calls, you have to be careful how you're recording them before you're using them for ID. So clutter calls, this is the same sequence of the bat that we just looked at in those clutter calls in real time. And it shifted to diagnostic search phase calls. Nice, crisp, identifiable calls. You can figure out what that is without any trouble. Now, if we use a statistics program in R, and I think a lot of you are probably familiar with R these days, in ggplot, hand release of this species here, Aptesicus, look at the frequency range down on the bottom. That's from a hand release. This is free flying, which is what you want to try and identify out in the wild. Look at the shift in frequency difference between hand release and free flying. If you're trying to identify the bat free flying in the wild from data that's from a hand release, it may put you way off target because you're going to be many, many kilohertz off. Frequency shifts, we also have figured out there's some things going on. There are variations in the vocal signatures depending on what the bat is doing when you're recording it. With lots of sample sizes and experience, this isn't going to confound anybody's identification. Some perceived variation is simply physics of sound, Doppler shift. Doppler shift is the change in the apparent frequency of a call sequence relative to the bat and the detector. Anyway, essentially as the bat moves to you or away from you, or the detector is moving to or away from the bat. It's relative to the speed of how we're moving. So an example, bat flying at 6.9 meters per second. This is a Doppler shift of 2%. So the bat's calling with a characteristic frequency of 40 kilohertz. You measure it, and you're going to record it at 40.8 with a 100 millisecond gap between calls that he's actually calling, but what you're going to measure is only 98. As the bat goes past the detector and goes the other direction, the frequency will appear to have dropped to 39.2, and then the interpulse distance will actually increase. Bat hasn't changed a thing that it's doing. Its calls remain the same. So you have about a 4% difference between the approaching and receding of the bat. Velocity is always relative to the observer. Once the bat's directly overhead, the relative velocity is 0, even if the bat's flying at 10 meters a second. Again, as the bat comes towards you, frequency increases. As he flies away, frequency is going to decrease. Here's an example of the common mustached bat in Central America. Same bat, here's the frequency 60 kilohertz, and you can actually see the frequency start dropping as he's flying away. Easy to see in a constant frequency bat. Typical vespertilianid or evening bat, again, the high frequency drops off in distance. We talked about that, and you can see the same thing there, ramping up, recording the higher frequencies, then dropping after it went by. Jamming avoidance is something we learned about in real time. This is the characteristic frequency of the common naked-back bat. If one guy's flying around the area foraging, in a conspecific, another individual of the same species comes in, one of them shifts its characteristic frequency. They don't want to jam each other. They want to hear their own echoes in order to feed. If we're both talking at the same frequency, neither one of us can hear. So one shifts. If the third one comes in, one will actually shift up higher. So once they leave and there's only one bat in the area, you only see the characteristic frequency. This isn't variation in the call sequences of the bat, it's just they're avoiding jamming each other's echolocation calls. So this wasn't to induce a state of my eyes glazed over, or like the kid in 6th grade, can I go home now? My brain's full. It's just to let you know that it appears deceptively easy. There are many things that can confound identification of free-flying bats. It's not impossible. In fact, it's easy for me to say, oh, it's relatively easy. And, you know, I've been doing it nonstop for 20 some years. But as long as you're aware of it, you need to be aware of all the complexities. So the auto black boxes, why you can't rely on. What and how are they measuring? You know, are they measuring the slope correctly? Are they measuring the characteristic frequencies? You need to understand what they're measuring. Are they measuring fragmented calls? Are they measuring portions of clutter calls that are in the call sequence? Are they measuring social call fragments that are in there? Most cases, we don't know. Fact of life with acoustics. In diverse areas, you're going to have multiple species in each recorded sequence. There's a species there, there's a species there, and there's a species going all the way across. So we have 3 species there, 2 genera. And so what does an automated ID algorithm measure? This is your call sequence, just a short segment of 15 seconds. What's it measuring? How's it going to tell you which one it is? Again, you folks have the best recognition software around, is your brain and human pattern matching. And that's really important, you know, to realize what's going on. It's not uncommon to have up to 5 species in a 15-second call sequence that's recorded in the tropics. Before I transition to data management, as you ponder acoustics, I think we probably should take a break. Clara said there was going to be caffeine, a staple of lucidity, and questions. As I say, you can always ask Alexa or Siri. And with that, I will stop there for a break. And, you know, I can do a couple quick questions. What's the situation with coffee? That's out front. Okay. Any quick questions before we take a break? Yes.
What do you do about some species that their signature call can look a lot like those commuting calls, like some velocities that have low frequency calls?
Well, once you're familiar with what the range is of the species that you're looking at, you need to understand what similar bat calls might be within that range. There's some early stuff that was done on the Florida bonneted bat that they were actually identifying commute calls of Nycticius, one of the other bats here is UMOPs, and they weren't, but they were actually way high in frequency for UMOPs, or real low frequency bats. But it comes with experience. I mean, if you're just starting out, it's definitely going to be a bit confusing. But when you start looking at things, and hopefully the fact sheets and looking at the call parameters, you know, it'll help you sort it out. But, you know, there are overlaps in a lot of these things, so it's not absolutely straightforward. Anything else? Okay. Do I need to do anything with the camera or anything? All right.